This is Iron Man VR, a full-blown AAA quality Iron Man game that actually puts you in the suit and lets you experience the rush of flying through wide open levels, blasting everything in your way. This game was a bucket list moment for me when it first launched on PSVR a few years ago, so I was very curious to see if the Quest 2 could deliver the same epic experience. Stick around, and I'll tell you how it did.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid. I am very excited to jump into this review with you, but quickly before we do, if you like this video, please like it, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing for continued VR goodness. And finally, leave us a comment because we like talking to you. Okay, let's get into my thoughts on Iron Man VR. Story-wise, developer Camouflage has certainly tried to deliver a standalone Iron Man narrative that seems to take place somewhere between the second and first film. Here, Tony has made his relationship with Pepper a commitment, and in doing so has agreed to cease the production of weapons by Stark Industries and instead focus entirely on the Iron Man suit program. Unfortunately, his past catches up with him and threatens everything he now holds dear. Shakespeare, this is not, but it's the perfect backdrop to give you an excuse to be Iron Man, and the story has enough twists and turns to remain semi-interesting throughout. Looking at gameplay, as an 80s kid that, like many, was obsessed with comic books, video games, and sci-fi fantasy movies, my answer to the age-old question of what superpower would you have if you could have only one was unequivocally to fly. So you can imagine my initial reaction when hitting the boosters for the first time. Oh my god. Camouflage spent nearly 3 years working on the flight systems in this game, and it really shows. With a combination of head movement and hand positioning, the sense of control in the air is equal parts intuitive and mesmerizing. If you've ever watched an Iron Man movie, then you know how to fly in this. While click and smooth turning along with seated play here are both offered as options, this is a game that really should be played standing in order to get the full impact and sense of freedom. The latter of which makes Iron Man VR's arrival on the standalone Quest 2 such a welcomed arrival, as despite how fun Iron Man VR was on the PSVR, the tethered cable and even more significantly the lack of 360-degree tracking of the PSVR headset did keep players, I guess, literally on a leash. Gleefully though, here on the Quest 2, everything gameplay-wise from the PSVR version remains. However, now players have complete freedom to move like they really are in the suit, spinning around to shoot enemies completely uninhibited. I loved playing this game on the PSVR, but I will admit, this is the way Iron Man VR was meant to be played. Now, of course, there are turning options for those looking to move or for those who prefer seated play, and yes, there are comfort options for those who need it, as this game goes out of its way to make sure it's a comfortable experience while also allowing VR veterans and fanboys alike to take off the training wheels and let it rip. Thankfully, Iron Man doesn't shy away from speed and instead actually doubles down on it, not only offering the ability to boost faster, but rather allowing players to upgrade that even further. Unfortunately, while the sense of speed is there, the sense of height is often not, likely due to a less aggressive stereoscopic 3D sense of depth to keep the performance in check. This issue is further dampened by an inherent issue to flying games in general, as they often simply lack much in the way of objects around you to help give the player a sense of depth, scale, and often speed. Case in point, Ace Combat 7 avoided much of this by giving us interactive cloud cover that we could get above and below, offering that sense of real-world scale. Iron Man VR does little of this in the vertical sense and instead goes for a more arcade approach to not only this, but much of its gameplay. In that, Iron Man VR is neither an on-rail shallow cash grab, nor is it a full-blown VR title with a deep upgrading gameplay system. What we do get, though, is maybe the best arcade action game ever made, offering its thrills in 30-minute action doses. As for the action itself, it is simple shooter fun that is greatly elevated by its flight system and its inherent thrill of being inside an Iron Man suit. As Iron Man, your controls and general loadout consist of flight boosters controlled by the triggers. Basic blasters are handled independently by facing your palms at the target and pushing the face buttons. Turning controls outside of real-world movement are handled by the analog sticks, and finally a rapid speed boost is handled by simply double tapping either trigger, activating that hand's respective booster. The armament of your suit starts off simple, however the game quickly ramps up its loadout options, offering a decent selections of weapons, shield, and boost upgrades. Keeping with the arcade approach, all of these are unlocked at the beginning and simply require crafting points that you earn by either playing missions or challenges. And while the immediate gratification approach to the upgrade system negates much of the game's progression, it does have the likely desired effect of offering players the thrill of playing the way they want almost immediately. Additional weapon add-ons are primarily added to each of your forearms and activated by dropping your wrist and clicking the fire button. Now, I will say most of these weapons often felt a bit samey and rarely did much higher levels of damage, but they do allow the player to customize to their playstyle. And while the game lacks much in the way of progression, there can be real depth found in its flight and flight mechanics for those who want to invest the time. For while Iron Man VR is wholeheartedly an arcade injection of fun, mastering the controls actually takes a bit of practice. And after about 8 hours in game, I still suck, but I found myself more often than not getting smoother, quicker, and more multifaceted in my approach to combat, often chaining together ranged, melee, and advanced flight techniques all at once. Graphics-wise, Iron Man VR is a wonder on the Quest 2, and I often found myself wondering just how Camouflage actually pulled this off on a standalone headset. Now, for those wanting a deep dive on the differences between the PSVR and the Quest 2 version, check out our side-by-side comparison video that Ryan put together. However, generally speaking, the Quest 2 version of Iron Man VR looks fantastic and feels just as fast and large as it did on the PSVR, with really only a bit of drop in texture detail and lighting effects being noticeable. Honestly, I'm not really sure how Camouflage managed to pull this off, as it even manages to keep much of the draw distance of the PSVR version while still taking advantage of the Quest 2's higher resolution display. Not unlike just about any flight game that has ever been made, Iron Man VR is visually at its best when up in the air, flying around. However, further time flying around in the game's handful of stages, and it's hard not to notice the compromises Camouflage had to make to bring this flight fantasy to VR. Bigger and visually more impressive stages like the opening plane sequence and the shield helicarrier stages, while nice to look at, quickly show themselves to be almost matte painting backdrops in which you'll never reach or land in. These spacious set pieces work just fine given the style of the arcade combat at hand, but is slightly immersion breaking and tends to highlight the game's already flat feeling. Unfortunately, with only really 5 set pieces recycled through the game's 12 stages, level fatigue does set in, and upon frequent revisits, this same level of fatigue can be felt when looking at the lack of enemy variation as well. Criticisms aside though, when taken as a whole package, Iron Man is still visually impressive and remains a visual marvel on the Quest 2. Sound-wise, Iron Man VR being a Marvel licensed game pretty much guaranteed that the sound design was going to be first rate.
What?
Incoming surface-to-air missiles.
Old Stark hover tanks? It's playing all the hits.
Your repulsors should be able to destroy those missiles.
Can't believe she dug these out.
Director Fury had a standing order for 2 fleets of tanks before we closed production.
Yeah, we miniaturized the turbines that keep the helicarrier flying. Created a true all-terrain vehicle.
Sound effects sound ripped right from the movies and immediately give the sense of authenticity, grounding it in the Marvel universe. Also, like the movies, the action here is loud and furious with explosions and laser blasts filling the sound mix. The cinematic flair is greatly doubled down on with the inclusion of the appropriately epic orchestral score that is bombastic at times and equal parts subdued when appropriate. You won't find any memorable music themes here really, but the soundtrack wonderfully elevates the game to theatrical film levels. Voice acting, while not from the film cast, are well delivered, but a little over the top, tending to make Iron Man VR come off more like a Saturday morning cartoon than the theatrical movies. The writing here also reinforces that, with a script that has the flavor of the characters we know, but with a noticeably different style and tone. The result is a Tony Stark that almost sounds like Robert Downey Jr. at times, but it just doesn't quite stick the landing. Regardless, the sound design here is top notch. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. Iron Man VR is not the deep experience some had hoped for, nor is it a cheap licensed cash grab. Iron Man's 12 stages can feel a bit samey, made even more monotonous by frequent repeats of the same 5 or 6 set pieces. However, it is a game that works much better when taken in short doses, where the flight and combat can be an absolute blast. The VR Grid gives this an 8 out of 10. This really does come down to what you want out of this game. If, like me, you want to feel the rush and freedom of looking up in the sky and moments later being there, there's simply nothing better for this than Iron Man VR. However, for some, this rush might fade quickly, and outside of the arcade combat, there just isn't much here to chew on. As such, when deciding to pick this up, especially at full price, I would recommend you decide on how much the rush of being Iron Man is worth to you. Anyways, guys, that's it for me. If you like this video, please hit that like button. Consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, I'll catch you on our next video.